Divisions in the world. It is the current significant divisions in the world that we must be concerned with, no matter our physical location. What I find in the world currently most pressing is the current division that is rapidly becoming a significant powder keg, with the possibility of being set off. What I find different about this time than previous times is the simultaneous questioning. It is not just democracies throughout the world being threatened or questioned. Authoritarian or totalitarian governments are also being questioned. While I believe governments of all kinds need to be held accountable, in these times some governments are being unjustifiably questioned in certain ways, while others are questioned justifiably. And yes, in general, I find a threat to a democracy more disturbing than a threat to an authoritarian or totalitarian. Yes, it is disturbing, but I believe this is not what I find most distressing. I see this time as an analogy of seeing both your car and your house on fire at the same time. I believe it is the simultaneous disruptions and the current interconnection of our modern world that sets this different from the past. Compared to the past, the movements of today become much more global and are not hampered by national, language, or cultural boundaries, as they once were. This would be worrying enough, but it is not just governments that are finding themselves in question or change, but also long-held institutions and even community systems. It can become so overwhelming that all is put back in the mind of the average person in daily life, but it is still there. But one thing that I hope is not overwhelming is a like, a subscription to this channel, or a contribution to either my PayPal or Patreon page. This really helps me bring you these messages. Back to the discussion at hand. The spark to this powder keg that is forming is the new distribution of what I call sides. In the past, these sides might be more definable by physical location. For example, during World War II, you had the Allies and the Axis. The Allies and the Axis could be easily defined by physical locations on the world globe. Some countries support one side, while other countries support the other. In past generations, two general opposing sides, excluding some resistance within, could be more easily defined by national boundaries. But today, while national physical boundaries do have an influence, they no longer have the proportional influence that they once did for past generations. For example, prior to World War II, there were fascist movements in the United States, movements calling for reform in the Soviet Union, resistance to the Nazis in Germany, Vichy France sympathies, and so on. But unlike the past, the world of today and worldwide ideological and political movements are much more globally interconnected than compared to the past. The movements of the past could start at one location, change the government of that location, then move on to other countries. While this still occurs, the movements are much more globally interconnected than before. Think of this analogy. In the past, a spark may set a forest on fire and then spread to another forest. Today, that same spark may begin in one forest, and the winds of today can carry that spark to another forest. In theory, the second forest could be fully and completely engulfed in flames before the first. Today, these movements can at times reach beyond the borders of the country where the specific occurrence is occurring. The movements of today surpass the physical boundaries of countries in ways and intensity as never before experienced. Rhetoric and actions by extremists on both sides continue to attempt to draw the middle into conflicts. Although the violence of one side, their irrationality, and the self-serving motives of their leaderships, as well as the perceived forcing of the passive aggressiveness for change from the other, seems to be at the forefront at the moment. Violence towards different groups has increased, or at minimum, become more relatively public recently. And because of increased interactions, we have become more aware. The redistribution of human populations in the world, both on international and national levels throughout the world for a variety of reasons, cannot be discounted as a contributing factor to the increased violence and tension. We cannot blame those responsible and reasonable citizens for attempting to migrate to better conditions. However, we must also consider the plight of those who are already there and believe that their way of life is threatened. We must consider that from their perspective, a way of life that has protected them for generations is being threatened. These disturbances, in my opinion, are also being taken advantage of by the extremists and opportunists. The opportunists uses this fear to promote their own less than altruistic goals. It is the extremists and opportunists that must be discredited, because we cannot afford to let ourselves become naive either. We must understand that many currently have concern or outright fear of extremism, others fear of not being extreme enough, some have a fear of fascist nationalism, and others a fear of independence lost to globalism. Many from all sides have a general fear of the overall course of our various advancements of social and technological worlds, along with how they will be implemented. Also, many have concern with various other advancements and movements. There are also fears by all sides of the general future of government, fear for humanity, fear for our various societies, and the world in general. But no matter what we are believing in or professing, in the end we must remember violence or destruction, and especially lies, will only invalidate us, no matter the cause. As explained, quoted in my ebook, Taking Action for a Better Tomorrow, a link to Chapter 1 is provided at the end of this video. Or feel free to download the entire text for free. Quoted in my ebook, in following the cause, we cannot afford to forget that when a cause becomes forgotten in the movement, the cause is lost. We cannot afford to sacrifice what we have sworn to protect in order to save it. We have lost when we temporarily set aside, ignore, or forget what we have sworn to protect. The saying, "the ends justify the means," may seem to be successful in the short term, but its contribution to the long-term viability of a cause has generally been negative over time. Sometimes, in retrospect, I often ask myself, are we really becoming fractionalized, or is the world just reorganizing itself? A reorganization not based on previous concepts of borders or boundaries. Do we need change in order to adapt to the different times? What will be lost? Yes, adaptation is necessary for survival, and we have changed in the past to survive. But what makes this different from the past is that there are less clear physical areas that one could point to a map and say, they are on that side and those are on the other. Yes, those in charge can be easily defined, possibly labeled, and in many cases already aligned as for or against, but the population cannot be so easily labeled. To give an example, the illusion of conservative or liberal practices when referring to cross-border mindsets over national mindsets. I say illusion because I personally believe both have been corrupted by hypocrisy or impracticality. While growing up in the United States, growing up in the countryside, and later living in large population centers with over millions of inhabitants, traveling to every state west of the Mississippi River and a couple on the other side, traveling 3 different provinces of Canada on countless occasions, traveling around Europe 6 months at a time, traveling to at least 13 different countries at that time, living in France for years, traveling more in Europe later and a couple more different countries, as well as a very brief 2.5 weeks traveling across Tunisia. There are very general similarities that I have noticed. People that live in the rural areas of the North American continent, European continent, and on the northern part of the African continent have more in common with each other than citizens living in different population density areas within their own country or continent. Of course, there are always some outliers and cultural exceptions, but these are generally outweighed when comparing the overall general way of life, attitudes, viewpoints in general, and in most generalities. And thank you again for a like, subscription to this channel, or a contribution to either my PayPal or Patreon page.